23%. That's the approximate reduction in cerebral blood flow, the volume of blood delivered to your neurons per minute that researchers have documented between early adulthood and age 70. Not 3%, not 8%, nearly a quarter of your brain's blood supply, quietly declining with every passing decade after 60. Now, here's the number that should stop you cold. In 2011, a research team at Wake Forest University gave a group of adults averaging 74 years old a high-nitrate diet anchored by one specific vegetable. 2 days later, they put them inside an MRI scanner and measured cerebral perfusion blood flow using arterial spin labeling imaging, one of the most precise perfusion measurements available. The result: measurably increased blood flow to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the frontal lobe white matter connecting them. These are, clinically speaking, the regions that go silent first in the early stages of memory decline. 2 days, one vegetable. A brain that looked perfusion-wise meaningfully different than it did before. That vegetable costs about 30 cents. You've probably walked past it in the produce section 100 times without knowing what it was doing, or more precisely, what it could be doing for your memory. I'm Dr. Laura Chen. I'm a board-certified neurologist, and I've spent 15 years watching what happens to memory before the tests catch it. That's the part most doctors don't talk about. The conversation almost never happens at a routine appointment. By the time a cognitive screening test flags something, the underlying vascular process has usually been unfolding quietly for years. What I see on perfusion imaging before the scores change is a quieting, specific brain regions receiving a little less blood than they should, a little earlier than they should. That quieting has a name, and it has a dietary countermeasure that the research community has been studying for over a decade, with results specific enough and verified enough that I think everyone over 60 deserves to understand them. Not in the vague language of eat your vegetables, in the actual language of mechanism, of MRI, of what's happening inside your vessels right now. Let me give you the foundation. Without it, everything I say next is just food advice. I want it to be something more than that. After 60, your brain faces a slow, nearly invisible process called cerebral hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion means insufficient blood flow. Not a stroke, there's no dramatic event, no sudden collapse. It's a gradual reduction, a quieting of the vascular supply to regions that require constant, rich oxygenation to function. Here's the mechanism. Your blood vessels are lined with a single layer of cells called the endothelium. When those cells are functioning well, they produce a molecule called nitric oxide NO. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It signals the smooth muscles surrounding your arterial walls to relax, to open, to let blood through with less resistance. It's your brain's internal pressure release valve, the molecule that keeps the microvessels feeding your hippocampus and prefrontal cortex open and responsive. Here is what changes after 60. The enzymatic pathway that synthesizes nitric oxide, specifically endothelial nitric oxide synthase, or eNOS, becomes less efficient with age. The endothelial cells respond more sluggishly to the signals that should trigger NO production. And as nitric oxide levels fall, those microvessels tighten. Blood moves through with more difficulty. The pressure required to push blood through stiffened, constricted vessels increases. And the regions with the least vascular reserve, the frontal lobes, the hippocampus, begin to operate at reduced capacity. In 2018, researchers at the University of Verona published a study in Frontiers in Physiology measuring cortical perfusion across patients ranging from healthy older adults to severe Alzheimer's disease. Their finding was clear and troubling. Cortical hypoperfusion did not merely correlate with the presence of Alzheimer's, it correlated directly with its severity. As NO bioavailability declined, cognitive function declined alongside it. The relationship was not coincidental, it was biological. And in a 2012 review in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, neurologists Toda and Okamura named it plainly. Cerebral hypoperfusion due to impaired nitric oxide bioavailability leads directly to cognitive decline and neurodegeneration. This is the central villain of today's video. Not amyloid plaques as an abstraction, not aging as an explanation. What happens first, quietly, in the microvessels of your brain is a failure of nitric oxide mediated blood supply. Your neurons are not getting enough oxygen, not enough glucose. They begin to function at reduced capacity silently long before any clinical test registers the change. And the regions that go dark first are the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, the exact structures most involved in the kind of memory loss people fear most. Everything in this video connects back to that single mechanism, cerebral hypoperfusion. The slow, measurable starvation of your brain's memory centers, driven by the age-related collapse of nitric oxide availability in your cerebrovascular endothelium. When I tell you that a 30-cent vegetable can measurably improve blood flow to the memory centers of the aging brain, I am not offering you a wellness claim. I am describing a specific, documented, MRI-verified intervention in that mechanism. A direct, upstream input to the exact chemistry your brain depends on and is running low on right now. Here is what makes this intervention different. It doesn't bypass the aging endothelium, it feeds it. It supplies the raw material for nitric oxide through a completely separate pathway, one that aging cannot shut down the same way it shuts down the enzymatic route. That pathway runs through the mouth, through specific bacteria on your tongue, and it begins with beetroot. Most people have heard that beets are healthy. They've seen them at juice bars, in sports supplements marketed to athletes half their age. What almost no one has heard explained clearly, specifically, is why beets are relevant to the memory of a 6-8-year-old. Here is what actually happens when you eat beetroot. Beetroot contains among the highest concentrations of inorganic dietary nitrate of any vegetable in the human diet. When you eat beets, that nitrate does not travel directly into your bloodstream. It first arrives in the mouth, where specific bacteria on the surface of the tongue and oral cavity convert nitrate to nitrite. That nitrite is swallowed, enters the stomach, and through several enzymatic pathways becomes nitric oxide. The same molecule your aging endothelial cells are no longer producing efficiently on their own. This pathway is called the nitrate-nitrite-no pathway. And it is critically important because it is not age-dependent in the same way the enzymatic eNOS pathway is. It doesn't require your endothelium to function perfectly. It doesn't require an aging enzyme to produce the molecule. It routes around the problem that aging creates and delivers nitric oxide through the back door. In the 2011 Wake Forest study, published in Nitric Oxide, Biology and Chemistry, adults averaging 74 years old received a high-nitrate breakfast containing 150 times more nitrate than a typical low-nitrate diet anchored by beetroot juice. After a 2-4-hour dietary intervention, MRI perfusion scans showed specific regional increases in cerebral blood flow, not a global improvement, a targeted one. Precisely in the frontal lobe, white matter connecting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the anterior cingulate cortex. These are the regions most vulnerable to hypoperfusion in early cognitive decline. The lead researchers, Dr. Gary Miller and Dr. Daniel Kim Shapiro, stated directly that dietary nitrate may be useful for improving regional brain perfusion in older adults in critical brain areas known to be involved in executive functioning. 1 2-day dietary intervention, 1 MRI, a measurable visible change in the most critical vascular territory of the aging brain. Here is where the story becomes practically urgent, because the research above used raw or minimally processed beetroot juice, not roasted beets from a can, not pickled beets in vinegar, not beet chips. The nitrate itself is stable. Heat doesn't destroy it. Cooking doesn't remove it. What removes it is simpler and more surprising: antibacterial mouthwash. The entire nitrate-to-nitric oxide pathway depends on oral bacteria, specifically species like Streptococcus salivarius and related nitrate-reducing organisms that live on the surface of your tongue. These bacteria perform the first and most critical conversion step, nitrate-to-nitrite. Without them, the dietary nitrate you consume from beets travels through your body without converting. It exits without triggering nitric oxide production. Research published in the journal Nitric Oxide found that use of antibacterial mouthwash completely abolished the blood pressure lowering effect of dietary nitrate because it eliminated the oral microbiome, performing the conversion. Over 30% of older adults use antibacterial mouthwash daily, often as a health behavior, often believing they are taking care of themselves. If you use antibacterial mouthwash and eat beets for brain health, you may be chemically canceling the mechanism you are trying to activate. The fix: use plain water to rinse or switch to a fluoride-only non-antibacterial mouthwash. Protect the oral bacteria that are doing biochemical work directly relevant to what your brain receives. Almost every conversation about beets and the brain focuses on nitrate. What it almost never discusses is the second active compound class, the one that may be equally significant and operates through an entirely different mechanism. Betalains, the deep red-violet pigments that give beets their characteristic color. The dominant betalain in red beetroot is betanin, and what betanin does in the brain is not about blood flow, it's about what happens to neurons under oxidative stress and amyloid accumulation. In 2024, researchers published in Food Frontiers a systematic screening of 24 isolated betalain molecules against amyloid beta aggregation, the protein clumping that is a defining hallmark of Alzheimer's pathology. 22 of the 24 tested betalains reduced amyloid aggregation. 8 of them reduced it by up to 100% in laboratory conditions. The researchers used transmission electron microscopy to visualize the amyloid fibrils directly and documented how betalains block their formation at the structural level. A 2025 review in Plants confirmed that betalains, particularly betanin and indicaxanthin, reduce neuroinflammation through NF-kappa B pathway modulation, suppress excessive neurotoxic nitric oxide, and protect neuronal cell membranes from lipid peroxidation. That last mechanism matters specifically for axons, the long projections connecting neurons whose myelin sheath is particularly vulnerable to oxidative breakdown in the aging brain. I want to be honest about the state of evidence. Most of these betalain findings come from preclinical and in vitro studies. We do not yet have large-scale human clinical trials testing betanin specifically in Alzheimer's patients. The 2025 systematic review in Nutrients by Shannon and colleagues acknowledged this directly while naming beetroot as a promising multi-mechanism dietary candidate for Alzheimer's prevention and management. 2 separate compounds, 2 separate mechanisms, 1 vegetable. That is what the phrase combined neuroprotective whole food means, and it is a meaningful distinction from taking an isolated supplement. A second landmark study from Wake Forest University, published in 2017, took the beet brain research one step further. Instead of testing beetroot juice alone, researchers combined it with exercise. Adults 55 and older with high blood pressure, not currently exercising, were randomized to 3 moderate-intensity treadmill sessions per week for 6 weeks. Half drank beetroot juice containing 560 milligrams of nitrate 1 hour before each session. Half received a placebo with virtually no nitrate. Functional MRI measured brain connectivity after the 6 weeks. The beetroot plus exercise group showed brain connectivity patterns in the somatomotor cortex that, according to the study authors, closely mirrored those of younger adults. Fewer compensatory cross-network connections, stronger, more efficient internal connectivity. Not a statistical trend, a measurable functional reorganization. Exercise alone improved connectivity, but beetroot juice plus exercise produced a synergy that exercise alone could not replicate. The mechanism is direct. Exercise increases cerebral blood demand. Nitric oxide from dietary nitrate enables the vascular response to meet that demand. The two together create a window of enhanced perfusion, more blood, more oxygen, more glucose, during exactly the period when the brain is most neuroplastic, most responsive to adaptive change. What this means practically: consuming beets approximately 60 to 90 minutes before a 20 to 30-minute walk may produce meaningfully greater brain benefit than either one alone. That is a specific, evidence-based recommendation, not exercise more and eat better. Eat this specific food at this specific time before this specific activity. The last item is not a mechanism. It is the frame that determines whether any of this matters. Every positive effect I've described improved cerebral perfusion, reduced amyloid aggregation, enhanced brain connectivity emerged in studies where participants consumed beetroot or beet-derived nitrate consistently. In the Wake Forest perfusion study, it was a 2-day high-nitrate dietary protocol. In the exercise connectivity study, it was 6 weeks of pre-workout beetroot juice. In a study published in the Journal of Diabetes and Metabolic Disorders, older patients with type 2 diabetes who consumed raw beetroot daily for 8 weeks showed significant improvements in sustained attention, processing speed, and fatigue resistance. None of these outcomes emerge from occasional consumption. They emerge from sustained dietary incorporation. And here's what I observe consistently in clinical practice. The patients who make real changes in their brain health over time are not the ones who try something for 3 days, see no result, and stop. They are the ones who understand that the cerebrovascular system responds slowly, cumulatively, and only to consistent input. The oral microbiome that converts dietary nitrate needs to be maintained. It adapts to what it is regularly given. Endothelial function responds to sustained nutritional support, not to occasional supplementation. Nitric oxide bioavailability builds over days and weeks of consistent dietary nitrate intake, not over a single meal. This is not about perfection. It is about pattern. Let me step back for a moment from the mechanisms and the studies, because I think there's a risk of something important getting buried. The reason all of this matters, the reason I wanted to make this video specifically, is not a perfusion MRI. It's not a p-value. It's the question that sits underneath every conversation I have with a patient who is beginning to notice something changing in how their memory feels. What are you actually protecting when you protect your brain? I think of a woman I followed for several years, beginning in her early 60s. She came in describing word-finding difficulty, occasional, mild. She described it the way most patients describe it at that stage, a small intrusion, an unwelcome guest she wasn't ready to name. Her cognitive testing was normal, standard battery, fully within age-expected range. By every clinical measure, she was fine. Her perfusion imaging was quieter. There was reduced flow in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, subtle, well within what any radiologist would file as age-appropriate change. Not alarming, not dramatic. I asked her about her diet. She described something thoughtful and varied. She cooked at home most nights, avoided fast food, tried to eat vegetables regularly. When I asked specifically about nitrate-rich vegetables, she told me she'd been avoiding beets for years because she didn't like them. She also told me she used antibacterial mouthwash every morning and every night, twice daily, without interruption for as long as she could remember. I didn't tell her the mouthwash caused her symptoms. That's not how medicine works, and I won't pretend otherwise. What I asked myself after she left was a different question entirely. How many small, compounding deprivations, each one invisible, each one insufficient on its own, to explain anything accumulate over a decade into the pattern I'm looking at on that scan? I don't have a clean answer. I still don't. But that question is why I make videos like this one. I want to be honest about what the science actually supports and what it doesn't. Eating beets will not reverse Alzheimer's disease. It will not undo decades of vascular compromise in a week. I would never suggest otherwise. What the evidence does support is this: the brain's vascular system is responsive. Even in aging, nitric oxide bioavailability improves with consistent dietary nitrate intake. Cerebral perfusion in specific critical regions can measurably change within days of sustained dietary intervention. These are not optimistic extrapolations. They are documented findings from MRI-verified human trials conducted at major research universities. The 2018 Frontiers in Physiology data showed that cortical hypoperfusion tracked with Alzheimer's severity. That means it also tracked inversely early in the process. Before the clinical threshold is crossed, the vessels still respond. The window is open. The endothelium still listens. You are likely in or approaching that window right now. That is not a frightening statement. That is the most useful thing I can tell you. Here is what the research supports, specifically and practically. 1. Eat beetroot in its most nitrate-preserving form, raw, lightly steamed, or cold-pressed juiced. A medium beetroot provides approximately 150 to 200 milligrams of dietary nitrate. Roasted beets retain most of their nitrate. Heat is not the enemy. Discarding the cooking liquid is. If you use canned beets, consume the liquid. 2. Reconsider antibacterial mouthwash. The oral bacteria responsible for the first step of the nitrate-to-nitric oxide conversion are killed by the same compounds designed to eliminate bad bacteria. A fluoride-only, non-antibacterial alternative preserves the oral microbiome, performing work that is directly relevant to what your brain receives from your diet. 3. Eat or drink beetroot 60 to 90 minutes before physical activity. Peak plasma nitrite, and therefore peak nitric oxide availability, occurs roughly 2 to 3 hours after consumption. Aligning that window with the elevated cerebral blood demand of even moderate exercise is the single most evidence-supported timing decision you can make with this food. 4. Incorporate beets 4 to 5 days per week at minimum, consistent, not occasional. The cerebrovascular response is cumulative. A beet salad every day for a month outperforms daily consumption for a week, followed by nothing every time. 5. Pair beets with a source of vitamin C. Citrus juice, bell peppers, or kiwi alongside your beets has been shown to improve the bioavailability of dietary nitrate by protecting nitrite from acid degradation in the stomach. A beet salad dressed with lemon juice is not merely palatable, it is biochemically synergistic. None of these require a prescription. None of them require a perfect lifestyle. They require you to understand what your brain actually needs, which you now do. Which of these 5 mechanisms surprised you most? And did the mouthwash finding change anything about how you think about your daily routine? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and what you share helps someone else ask the right question. If someone you love is over 60 and hasn't had this conversation, send this to them, not to alarm them, because knowing the mechanism changes what you do about it. I make these videos because I believe every person deserves the conversation their doctor didn't have time to have. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Everything I've shared here is based on published research and my clinical experience in neurology. Your brain is unique before making any changes, especially if you're managing a diagnosis or on medication. Please talk to your own doctor. That conversation is always worth having.